Hi folks, I'm Gheeotine, and welcome to this week's Build Showcase. Now, I've got a few projects and things coming in the pipeline, including an episode of Minimum Spec Gaming with a current release, probably set to come out next week, but until then, I wanted to highlight one of my usual building methods. And this week it's going to be me going onto the marketplace, finding an exceptional value, upgrading it to meet modern standards, and then putting it back out into the market for a reasonable price to make someone else happy. With all that said, let's look at today's featured machine, a CyberPower pre-built. According to the seller, he got this machine about 5 or 6 years ago, and it cost him about $800. Bearing in mind that was about the peak of the crypto boom that sucked up graphics cards like an overclocked vacuum cleaner, it seems about in line for the parts included. Nowadays, a similar machine is considered fairly priced for around $250 to $300, which is why I'm immensely pleased to say I got this one for a car ride and a single Benjamin Franklin. Yes, for $100, we got this excellent foundation. Now, for $100, it's a pretty decent gaming machine on its own. Spec-wise, we have an i5-8400 with 6 cores running at 2.8 GHz and a 3GB GTX 1060. Now, there are a fair number of parts and orientations in this machine that are heavily indicative of the times that are, shall we say, less than ideal for modern sensibilities. We have a 120GB SATA SSD as a boot drive, and given the size, your operating system and a few basic support programs are all you'd want to put on it. For bulk storage, we have a 1TB Western Digital hard drive, functional and fine for the use of storing a game library, but larger titles can suffer from longer load times or hitches in performance. Especially with the next part, a single 8GB stick of 2400 DDR4 RAM. To be perfectly clear, while I ascribe to the notion of if it works, I will go to places like my local Walmart, see the pre-built gaming PCs on display, see a single stick of RAM, and feel a sensation of disgust. Especially when I see the prices that they are asking. But as I said, this is a decent gaming machine as is for $100. So before anything else, let's do some preliminary benchmarking and see what it can do. Starting off, we have the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark. At high settings, we come out swinging with an average of 54 frames per second and our lows around 40. Given the 3GB limitation of the graphics card, it's still impressive how good things can look. Yeah, this game is getting a bit old at about 8 years since release, but it is very well optimized and still holds up from a visual fidelity angle. Given the recent inflation of components across the board and the likely lowering of standards for various games to need to run, I'd say this is a good example that modern games should endeavor to compare to. Cyberpunk 2077 on the lower preset at 1080p was by all means acceptable. Lows of around 35 FPS and an average of 46 meant you could experience the campaign as is with relative ease. But this is also at 1080p. If you wanted a smoother experience, always remember going lower is an option. Speaking of going lower, I'm finding one irritation with Dirt 5. When going into graphical settings, it has the various quality presets, but as far as automatically determined recommended settings, it tells you nothing. On this machine, if you select automatic, you'll get really decent frame rates around 100 FPS, but it tells you nothing of use, just automatic. If I had to guess, I'd say it's on low textures and details with some upscaling. That said, manually setting to medium settings and native rendering, the average was around 60 FPS, with lows around 50. Cult of the Lamb is set to be getting a paid expansion soon, and I intend to cover it, and this testing served as a nice refamiliarizing of the game. Anyway, with my late game village, an average of 60 FPS was pretty typical, with the most significant hits to performance being when I was browsing menus to select opponents for the dice minigame. In the dungeons, once loading a room had been completed, averages of 150 to 180 FPS meant that this would be a great machine to start your own cult. More enemies could drag it down, but in the midst of action, I was pressed to see a frame rate that wasn't in triple digits. Metro Exodus set some high expectations for me. 4A games, now rebranded to Reburn, have a reputation for really well optimized titles that exude detail and atmosphere. That said, the game initially preset itself to low settings at 1080p, but seeing the frame rate was still regularly over 80 to 100 FPS, I decided to experiment with medium. The result was not really that much of a hit. Open areas still had us over 60 FPS, and lows around 50 meant that the atmosphere would remain intact and the action playable. Being admittedly a bit overambitious, I tried to play Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. unfortunately, it absolutely refuses to run unless you have a GPU with at least 4 GB of VRAM. Good to know if I ever decide to run it through minimum spec gaming. The only multiplayer game I really regularly play anymore is Team Fortress 2. That said, on the highest settings, lows around 120 FPS and an average around 150 meant that, even with the handicap of having to use my mouse on my thigh while benchmarking, I was still more than able to frag. But finally, how does this machine handle Crysis Remastered? Well, I'm quickly learning that the game can't be trusted with its own presets, preferring to go to a tick lower than what the hardware can actually handle. That said, even medium wasn't that much of a strain. Lows around 95 and an average of 105 mean that this machine, as I said, is a beautiful value for what I paid. And there's the machine as is as I brought it home. Really not a bad deal for $100, but I've got enough machines.
Way too many, if I'm being perfectly honest.
So with all that said, let's do what I said I was going to do from the start. Beef it up, bring it to a modern standard, and then sell it to a reasonable price for someone that I hope to make very happy. So that said, what do we do first? Well, after removing the 1060 so we have some easier workspace, the easiest, most logical upgrade is to double the RAM. Going from 8GB to 16GB running in dual channel will help with almost everything. Next, the boot drive. Removing the 120GB SATA SSD and switching over to a 1TB Western Digital Blue NVMe will ensure snappier operation and abundantly shorter load times on larger games. Next up, a refreshing of the thermal paste will help the CPU a bit, but I don't like stock Intel pushpin coolers. They do the job, but they look rather meager and feel flimsy. So, opting for something a bit more robust, I threw on a Thermaltake Gravity i2. More than enough of an upgrade to keep an i5-8400 in check, and a bit better looking in my opinion. Finally, we have the most substantial upgrade for the machine. An RTX 2070. More than doubling the VRAM to 8GB, and bearing in mind the limitation of a 500-watt power supply, it's about at the upper limit of what I'd recommend using for the current orientation. Now, before we get to round 2 of benchmarking, I have to highlight something. Initially, I thought the next step was going to be the easy but relatively tedious process of installing Windows. This proved to be a royal pain in the ass. My plan was to run my secret weapon, which is an unupdated copy of OG launch Windows 10, which enabled me to not require a Microsoft account. I ended up having to reinstall 3 times, and each time it kept crashing, failing to adequately handle updates, and made every step following after excruciating. The first time I thought it was due to a bad install or file that didn't copy properly during the install. After the problems persisted, in the second attempt, I began to expand my troubleshooting. I thought that maybe the board was having difficulties with the NVMe, so I did a BIOS update. Finally, after scrapping the 10 to 11 plan, just going straight to a Windows 11 ISO, still seeing problems and having hitches, I downloaded OCCT, and that's when it told me that the problem was a bad stick of RAM. During the current market, that was the last thing I wanted to hear, but fortunately I did have a few extra kits that I'd squirreled away before things got bad. Swapping the sticks out, it was night and day. The machine was usable, and I was able to get set up as needed. And I feel like this should be the most important instruction if anyone wants to build, fix, or flip PCs. Put in the work. Test your machines. Don't be the guy that takes advantage of unsuspecting people who don't know any better and don't know computers like we do. It is a terrible thing to see someone get exploited like that. I stand by my machines. After a PSU started to go bad a week after I sold the machine it was in, I swapped out that PSU in the dining area of a McDonald's an hour from my home because I will not let my name and reputation get sullied by shoddy work or parts. Don't be the scammer. Don't be a scumbag. Anyway, rant over. Finally, before we go into benchmark session 2, let's go over the parts I threw in and what we ultimately spent, taxes and shipping included. Prices may not be totally reflective of the current market since I bought stuff before things went south, but that's just the way things go. Anywho, starting out, the base machine was $100, the new RAM kit was about $36.72, the new cooler was $650, and the NVMe SSD was about $63, and finally, the GPU was $135. Altogether, this machine, not counting travel, time, or effort spent, came to $341.22. Who says you can't get a quality machine these days? But, all that said, what are we looking at now for round 2 of the benchmarks? Shadow of the Tomb Raider opened up with a tremendous uplift. Aside from a brief window in the opening of the benchmark run, stats nearly doubled. In fact, the average did double, and that was with the settings increased from high to highest. Cyberpunk 2077 wasn't much different in the context of the uplift Shadow of the Tomb Raider saw. Swapping to Ultra settings, we saw an average of 77 FPS. The minimum was also basically what the average was the first time around. Not bad, right? With round 2 of Dirt 5, I didn't bother with letting the game decide for itself. I just rammed it to Ultra settings and took it for a ride. That said, in spite of the preset being rammed up 2 notches, the frame rate was nearly identical. Lows around 50 and an average of about 60. I don't know about you, but I'd probably knock it down 1 notch on the preset and have nothing to complain about. Cult of the Lamb was an outlier in the benchmarks the second go-around. It wasn't exactly pressing hardware to any limits the first time, so not really seeing a substantive uplift wasn't too surprising. Lows and averages were the same, then again, any GPU with 3GB of VRAM is more or less likely overkill. Metro Exodus didn't mess around. After upping to the high preset, lows and averages practically doubled. The lows never went below 90, but an average of just over 130 FPS can't help but impress. That doesn't necessarily stop me from making stupid gameplay decisions. I like stealth, but I can be really bad at it. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart was a better showing this time around. It ran. Checking the settings, it was preset to high quality, but after I manually turned off all the upscaling and frame generation to ensure the game was running entirely natively, the game settles around 65 FPS, with minimums rarely going just below 50. I'll probably be playing this on an overkill system soon, but this one seems pretty good as is. Team Fortress 2 was basically a repeat of Cult of the Lamb in that there weren't substantial changes since the game never fully taxes most modern hardware. Given the map itself can have a bit of influence on performance, to see no real changes was, I guess, kind of validating. But finally, how does the upgraded system handle Crysis Remastered? Well, I opted to go to the high setting since the game tried to say medium, but it probably could have handled the Can It Run Crysis preset. High saw lows around 75, but even under fire and in stressful conditions, 110 FPS was frequently where the game preferred to settle, showing this machine has been elevated to quite a comfortable place. Honestly, today's video was kind of a mishmash. I like my content to come away with some kind of positive messages or to illustrate ways to counter negativity in the space of PC gaming and building. With the market going the way it is, and the economy continuing to stagnate under the best interpretations, I can't help but feel a bit saddened. But that's probably why I did this video today, to show that options are out there and to be part of the counterweight to the mentality that you don't have any choices. Whatever the case, I showed there are deals out there, and strategic and intelligent upgrades can still be obtained. Whatever the case, I'm gonna now get ready to put this machine out there. Hopefully it'll make someone very happy. Alright, before I get to this week's Q&A session, there's one thing I wanted to address. In my last video I said Xeon processors need ECC RAM. Apparently I'm wrong on this. And in all honesty, I'm actually kind of happy about this. Me being wrong means I learned something, so if I ever do something wrong or make a mistake in a video, call me out on it. I'm genuinely happy to be corrected. Alright, with that, on to the questions. What's my profession outside of YouTube? Not specific, but like your job sector. For reasons, I do like to keep my professional and personal lives separate, or I guess you could even say my YouTube life is a third facet, but anyway, to answer this and be not specific enough, let's just say I work in the sector of public safety. Any plans on testing X58 or Phenom 2 platforms? Not at this time, but maybe someday. I don't really go into any particular piece of hardware with the intention of making video. I just kind of do it on a whim. My video production decisions are extremely fickle and subject to change, so, you know, could be someday, but not at this time. Finally, how many GPUs, CPUs, motherboards, RAM sticks, complete PCs do you have that you can show us?
Way too many, if I'm being perfectly honest.
You always seem to be building or buying new stuff, and you must have tons of stuff. Yeah, you ain't kidding. Let's see, just looking around in my immediate proximity, I have my daily driver, a test bench, my Hot Wheels PC, the doubler, a server where I keep all my video assets and just general backups on, the machine featured in today's video, my girlfriend's computer that I recently built, another machine that I'm selling to a neighbor. I've got my four-way SLI machine. That's been converted to three-way recently. I've got my open-air test bench. This is not even a joke. That is just all the machines that are within approximately 8 feet, within 8 feet of me at this time. As far as graphics cards and individual components, I could not even begin to tell you. But anyway, that's it for this week's video. Thanks for watching, and keep your head on your shoulders.